Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, ever since the Cyberpunk 2077 system requirements were announced, I've constantly wondered if the lowest specs suggested by CD Projekt Red could handle the game, and if so, with what settings? Well, today we can finally find out. Welcome to another minimum specs build. In these videos we take a look at how a gaming PC built to the exact minimum system requirements of certain AAA titles actually handle the games. Should you build a PC tailored precisely to one game's suggested requirements? Absolutely not, but it's sure fun. So, the developers state that the minimum specs have been created with the low settings and 1080p in mind. I've gone with the i5 3570K and GTX 780 combination today because second-hand Core i5s are cheaper on the used market than older AMD processors right now, at least here in the UK, and the GTX 780 is older than the RX 470 and weaker, so I thought why not throw the worst case scenario at this game right off the bat. Our PC also has 8 gigs of dual channel DDR3 as suggested, and I'm running the game off of an SSD. The game is also patched to the latest and current at the time of this video version 1.03. Please be aware that performance will vary depending on where you are, and from what I've seen there can be some pretty hard hitting areas. More about that later. For now, I've started off in the countryside. This is a very early point in the game, so as to avoid any major plot spoilers, though early mission objectives are visible on screen. So, we're outside of Night City at the moment and we're running the game at 1080p with the low preset with 100% resolution scale. This is full 1080p with no sacrifices, and to be honest the performance isn't great. However, even at low the game looks very good, and it's hard to really show that through a YouTube video. Initially, I spent some time just driving about, taking it all in, and for the most part the frame rate stayed above 30, though there were some dips below this. We'll move on to Night City later on, where things actually become more CPU dependent. Here though, it's actually the GTX 780 that's holding us back, and the 4-core 4-threaded i5 is holding its own fairly well. Our system RAM usage is climbing up and over 6GB, and this will continue climbing to around 7. Remember, in keeping with the minimum specs, we only have 8GB installed. Honestly, this game is really good looking. It's easy to forgive the frame dips when things do look this good, but I suppose we must take off the rose-tinted glasses and discuss how we can improve performance without sacrificing too much visually. So luckily for us there is a dynamic resolution option in the graphical menu. The gameplay you're seeing here is from a 70% to 100% dynamic resolution scenario. Basically I've configured the game to run between 70% of 1080p and full 1080p, depending on what is happening on screen. We could turn this down even more, but even so, 60 frames per second will not be possible here, unfortunately. This sort of system is best suited to 30 FPS, which is totally fine for me, but personal preference varies from gamer to gamer. Making this change boosted our frame rate up from 34 to 41 and improved our percentile figures as well, which means that there was far less stutter as well as noticeable frame drops. We are still away from the madness of the city at the moment, but let's take a quick look at how a combat situation affects the performance here. Here we are being driven along while having to wipe out multiple vehicles out the window. I thought that this would impact the frame rate quite a bit, and as it turns out you will notice drops at full 1080p, but we are still using that dynamic resolution option here, and I will continue to do so throughout this video simply because 1920 by 1080 in its native form just causes too many sub 30 FPS dips. It's not a terrible experience by any means, and honestly I think given the specs this game holds up okay, but a dynamic resolution provides us with a much better overall experience. Now the frame rate during this scene didn't really change too much from the previous driving scene, which is nice to see, but let's move on to some Night City performance now. This sequence takes place indoors and involves a shootout with a few enemies at the same time. We're still running a dynamic resolution here, which I'd recommend doing if you have similar hardware, and it turns out that we were seeing a slightly better average performance here than we were outside of town. This was to be expected, as although there is more happening on screen, it's all taking place within a single room, and there isn't a vast expansive environment in the background to be rendered, for now. While the performance gameplay is up, I just want to give you my initial impressions of the game itself. I've played for a few hours at the time of this voiceover, and I have to say I'm really enjoying it. When I first saw the trailers years ago, I didn't really think too much of it, but if I'm honest now, I'm really having a good time with this title, and I don't know why I ever doubted CD Projekt Red. I really respect the fact that despite the performance issues with older hardware, it still actually starts and runs too. In a world where the GTX 7 series cards can sometimes find themselves unsupported, it's nice to see them still working here. Right, I want to show you this car chase now, because this is where things get a bit much for our hardware. Though the average frame rate does still stay above 30. Unlike the countryside sequences, scenarios like this that happen downtown will have a much bigger impact on performance, and while it's not a significant issue, I wanted to point it out nonetheless, because at this point the game is pretty much sticking to that 70% end of 1080p, so we're running at something like 1344 by 756. Honestly, it still looks good, and I prefer using the dynamic system than actually choosing a native 720p. It's also in Night City where our CPU usage starts to rise. For the final segment then, here we are right in the heart of the busy city streets. This i5 is starting to really feel the pressure here, with a load that often hits 100% usage. This is where 8 threads would really come in handy, so something like an i7 on the same socket would really help. That said, you'd still likely be constrained by the graphics card in that instance, so I'm not sure how much of a performance boost there would really be. So far things have run okay. I and some of you on Twitter didn't think that this would hit 30 FPS or that the game would even start, so if we compare this to those assumptions, then we're doing alright. Honestly, I stayed up especially last night to watch Santiago's stream just to see if the 750 Ti would launch this game as well, and it did. I could then sleep relieved that this card should therefore at least start the game as well, and I'm glad to see that it worked. So while the game does seem to be playable even with the weaker of the two minimum spec configs, there are certainly some sacrifices that need to be made. This final piece of footage actually shows the game running at a locked 60% resolution scale, so 1152 by 648. The reason for this is because we hit a huge crowd of people and the dynamic resolution was causing dips to the mid and low 20s. I think the inner city is going to give you more trouble, no doubt, especially if you have what's now considered by some to be low-end hardware, and locking the frame rate to 30 might even be the best bet, with a lower than native display setup. Personally, I'd stick to dynamic resolution and just endure some of the dips for the sake of a little more graphical clarity, but as always, it's up to you. On a quick side note, the game is also available to be streamed through GeForce Now, if you have a good enough internet connection, of course. I actually started playing the game on my iPad before continuing on PC, just to test out GeForce Now, and it seemed to run pretty well even with my okay internet, so this may be an option worth considering. Anyway, this has been the Cyberpunk 2077 minimum specifications PC. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know if performance was how you thought it would be, better than what you thought or a lot worse than what you thought. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know how the game runs on your old hardware, especially if you have a 7 series Nvidia card as well, or one of those older AMD RX GPUs. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.